All right, so this is a new episode of the podcast. I try, I guess, it kind of depends on my state of mind, but I'm trying to deliver it not ironically, if that's possible. Not ironically. But, like if you have a podcast and not ironically, but I want to deliver it not ironically, meaning that I want it to be really genuine, but I guess that's always the thing I'm talking about, whether directly or indirectly. But even so, even if I always talk about it, is easier it's easier if I don't have my headphones in and I don't have to hear my voice, and but that's all right. I want to deliver it not ironically, like I want it to be really clear, and I don't want it to be any sort of performance. If I'm able to get to the point that it's not a performance, then I win the game. Then I win the game of life. But that's the thing. Is it always? It's not a performance because there's things that you do that are just things that you do. It has to be an action in order for it to not be a performance. But what am I even saying? I'm saying that I tend toward a performance. And I tend toward a performance because there's just a lot of things that you can't say. But the world that we live in kind of forces us into a performance to some degree. There's some amount that we're performing as long as there's things that we can't say. Because as long as there's things that we can't say, we're trying to fit the mold of someone. We're trying to fit somebody's mold. And in this case, it is the mold presented to us by a society where the authorities of the society are expecting us to fit the mold. And in this case, fitting the mold is us saying the right things, meaning that the things that we're not supposed to say, we don't say those. We avoid all necessary taboos in order to get by. So to some amount, there is a mold that we have to fit, and when that's the case, there are things that we individually to ourselves from ourselves that we want to say. There are things that we want to say as individuals that would come up, but because we're not allowed to say them, we avoid them and conform to instead an acceptable line of speech. And it's not the case that I wouldn't say that there's so many things that we can't say in society today in order to be politically correct. But there are a few things that we can't say. There's a lot of topics that are just clearly not, and a lot of states of being, ways of being that are not acceptable. For instance, you're not really supposed to be aggressive because aggression is a taboo of sorts, especially according to the left. But sometimes the left can influence things to the point that they're actually deep-seated in our minds as things that we're not supposed to do or talk about or live out. And maybe one of those things is the idea of aggression, because liberals are sort of, I would say that they're the originators of the idea that aggression is bad. And so aggression comes from the set of characteristics of masculinity. It's a subset of masculinity, aggression, as long as you are attributing aggression to men and not to women, which is something that the left likes to do. They attribute, because that's why they see it as evil, to the point that if aggressive behavior is happening, then that is evil behavior. You can't be aggressive because aggression is bad. And in the last couple years, well, at least in the last year, I feel like a lot of power and influence that liberals had in our society has gone away, because ultimately their influence and power comes from the media, and the media doesn't exist the same way it did before. It doesn't really have influence, and it doesn't have influence because social media undermines it. Social media beats journalism to the punch, and because of that, journalism doesn't have anything to say that hasn't already been judged by everybody already through social media. Like any story that is important, the judgments for that story are given by everybody. Everybody gets to make their own judgment on that story because everybody has accounts on social media. So the public opinion for any one story is divided among everybody individually, whereas it used to be heavily influenced by whatever journalist was showing us the story, because we would all have to read that, and the journalists used to be given credit to have authority over what was a news story and what isn't and what wasn't. But it's not so much that way anymore, because the judgment on stories is from regular people. Like everybody gets the opportunity to be the journalist and really report the story the way that they want. They can tweet about it and say things about it whatever way that they want, and get into Twitter battles with people over it, and that is the story, and that is the result of the story. Like that's the impact is already seen on Twitter, like what people take away from it and what the result is and how it affects people is already decided on social media, because it is on social media where people engage with the content, and it happens there before it could ever be a story from CNN. Like if CNN wants to make it a story, something that is a story that's big on Twitter or like social media or somewhere, at the point that CNN decides, okay, that's a story, and by the way, they don't even have authority to say what's a story and what isn't anymore, because it's only Twitter that decides what a story, like a story that is influential and important in the world today, or at least in America, is not important if it wasn't a story on Twitter. If it was only a story from CNN and Fox, it has less influence than something that was a story on Twitter, or because stuff that is a big deal on Twitter, even for 1 or 2 days, is what is important to people in the country. So CNN and Fox don't really have the authority to say what's a story and what isn't anymore. The stuff that they report on as stories that aren't like already noticed by social media aren't stories, because influence is with social media. It is less and less with CNN and Fox News, especially because the mediums in which they have to present their stories and their information are less and less traveled in mediums and less participated in mediums of entertainment or of showcasing the content that they have. So it matters less and less what CNN or Fox News would say about the world, and it matters less and less what narration that they're presenting to the world of the world's events, or presenting to America about the way that America is going, the way that it is unfolding, the way that America as an entity is transpiring. The narration of America's existence as an individual is no longer narrated by mainstream media, because mainstream media has lost its influence in lieu of a level of higher intelligence of reporting stories, pretty much. And that's what the internet is. It's higher it's a higher level of intelligence in which we can, in which stories are reported, because they're stories that are, because what the story is ultimately is true from everybody's different perspective. It's not ultimately up to the authority of one journalist who decides this is a story and this is the spin, even though they're tailoring it to a certain audience or whatever. But so I'd say like in the last year especially, like a lot of the mainstream media, and especially because the mainstream media is mostly liberal, but like, and I know Fox News is conservative, but the narration that we had to live in this country of the way that things were going in the country, as dictated to us by journalists, was generally, well, I mean, it's go against Trump and go against conservatives. Like, it's the message mostly from the mainstream media is that we are all on the same page, and that same page is we're against Trump and we're for all these progressive values, is the message that was given to us by media. And we see with the dissolving of the authority of media, really, is what's happened in the last year. We've seen the dissolving of the authority of the mainstream media and it's given way to the authority of media as it's presented on social media. Like, it's given way to the authority of social media, which is a higher form of media, but it's a more relatively truthful way of interpreting the news, because it is news, and everybody's reportings on the news all collected into one. It's news that's given to you as a result of many different people's opinions instead of just one person's opinion. And so because the story and the impact of the story is given as a composite average of many different people's opinions, it is more relatively truthful. It is because it's a result of many different opinions instead of just a couple opinions from a news network that ultimately had an agenda with their opinions. Like, CNN or Fox could release a story now, and a lot of people could watch and listen to it or whatever. But I'd imagine some of the problem that they're facing is they don't have the ability to tailor it to their specific audience as much anymore, meaning that Fox has a Republican audience, CNN has a Democratic audience, and they write stories that are tailored to their audiences, but they still like to take the title that they're unbiased, even though they're not. They're biased in one direction or the other, and ultimately people realize that and seek an outlet for the news, or a different interpretation on the news than what is given by Fox or CNN, because they're tailoring their news to an audience. But and because they're doing that, and because they have an agenda, and because the story that they report is from a smaller group of people, the story that they report is less truthful, and people can see that, and people can see that more and more now, especially because we don't have to rely on them for the news. We have a stronger version of the news that's given to us through social media, and through the opinions of the collective opinions of many different people, instead of singular opinions given by singular entities such as CNN or Fox. Like, if you hear the report on a story now, like Ricky Gervais at his speech at the Golden Globes was really big for a couple days. Like, people were talking about it a lot. It was a big story in this country for a couple days, and everybody wanted to go see what it was all about and see the video. And that's another thing. You can go and see the video of what happened for a lot of things. Like, you can see Ricky Gervais's speech at the Golden Globes and see that you can see all that, everything that he said, and then interpret it from your own perspective. But pretty much that becomes big because everybody's talking about it on social media. It doesn't become big because of CNN or Fox's take on it. So it becomes a story because it's big on social media, and also you get to see everybody's opinions on it, and then make your own judgment from a lot of different people's opinions, because on social media you get a lot of different nuanced opinions, since everybody in the world, regular people, have the opportunity to comment on what happened with Ricky Gervais at the Golden Globes. But like if the New York Times or the Washington Post runs an article on it, it's going to be tailored to an audience, Democratic audience, and it'll say that Ricky Gervais just like made an ass of himself, or at least you shouldn't paint him in as positive a light as people are saying, because it was actually terrible. But they say that because they're tailoring it to an audience, and of course that is relatively less truthful. And part of the reason why it is relatively less truthful to say that like Ricky Gervais should be painted in a negative light for the things he said at the Golden Globes is because the source it's coming from is tailoring it to an audience, and is a smaller sample size of opinions than the sample size of opinions of the way that the story is presented and interacted with on social media. And so because of that, and because they get to their story later, because they have to set it up the right way and write a nice piece on it rather than just send it out into the world, because they have to. So the Washington Post or the New York Times has to write an article on it, and they have to set it up the right way because they're tailoring it to an audience. And because they have to set it up the right way, it's more of a presentation. It's something that they have to present to people. It has to be a well-written article, have a good beginning and middle and an end. It has to fit certain standards of writing an article that have been in place for forever. Like you have to write an article a certain way, even though you can have your own flair about it or whatever. So the Washington Post or the New York Times has to make Ricky Gervais look bad because that's part of their agenda. But in order to do that, they have to take this time to set up a well-written article and make sure that it fits their audience, because they have an audience, and it's basically just a presentation. Because they have an audience and they're tailoring it to an audience. What they're saying is just a presentation, and it's a presentation because it's a well-written article that has a beginning that needs to begin the right way and an ending that needs to end with like a good solid punch and collect together the rest of the article. It has to be a good finale to the article. It has to be well-written, the thing that they write about Ricky Gervais. But when it's a story on social media, there's nothing that has to be written about it. There is no presentation involved. The only presentation is what happened, and then you judge what happened from your own perspective. And so because of that, the media of social media undermines mainstream media because it's better, and it's obviously better. It's obviously better because there aren't pretenses involved with it. There aren't pretenses involved with it because it is directly out of your mouth, basically, is the report on the story, is out of your mouth. It's what you think about it. And because of that, there aren't pretenses. There isn't a middleman for the story to go through before it gets to you. It can't be watered down or compromised in any way. The story, it can't be compromised anymore because we don't have to rely on the mainstream media's take on it. All that we have to rely on is our own perspective or our opinion that comes as a result of looking at a great deal of other people's opinions. So it's a presentation is what Fox News or CNN is ultimately doing, and it is a presentation because they have an agenda, and because they have an agenda, having an agenda is very similar to, it's basically the same thing as, well, ultimately it's the same thing as having an audience. You have an audience, and because you have an audience, you have to present it right, meaning there's some amount of falseness in what you're doing. You can't just say it Like the people that craft an article at CNN or write a piece that they're going to air, or like the way that they write a TV show for the way that their anchors talk to each other or talk to guests that they have that are on like their live channel. The way that they write everything has to be written the correct way. Like it has to be done in line with a certain set of standards and conduct and rules, because they have to follow their rules in order to carry out their formula. And they have a formula because they're a specified, distinct corporation that has its own way of getting money in its own way that it's been getting money. And it exists as this intelligent entity that has its own way of doing things and its own way of trying to survive. And it has to follow its formula in order to survive. CNN or Fox, it has to follow its formula. And it's almost like you following a formula, or you following standards that you had in the past, is always you trying to survive, and is always in some way a presentation. But you just going back to whatever ways that have kept you surviving before without adapting your model to change to make you more like the world as it stands today. Like if CNN or Fox doesn't change their model significantly, then they will be obsolete rather quickly, because there are higher forms of intelligence that are undermining them and making it so that they are more and more obsolete. And those higher forms of intelligence are forms of intelligence that are doing the same thing that our media, which I'm talking about social media, it's media that is doing the same thing as you, but doing it more truthfully. And the stories presented on social media are inevitably more truthful because there are fewer pretenses involved and fewer barriers to entry of interpretations of the story, when the stories presented by CNN and Fox are littered with rules. They're littered with rules that they have to follow. Fox has to follow a great deal of rules in order to write one of their articles, because it has to fit the audience that they're sending it to in all these different ways. Yeah. So I'm talking about presentations, and then I was talking about how like our society was under the influence of the mainstream media and the ideology of liberalism for a number of years, like probably the last 15 years besides the last like 1.5 or 2. Like the predominant ideology, I would say, is liberalism in this country for a while, especially during the Obama era, but also because the mainstream media is mostly liberal, and the narration that they presented for us as Americans is one of us following liberal ideology, because mainstream media practices liberalism. And with the dissolving of the influence of mainstream media, now we have the chance to start a new predominant ideology, I would say, over liberalism. I don't feel as though liberalism has, I think that it's seen its peak and will now go away. And I'd say that the main reason for that is because they got their power from the media, and the media no longer has any power. But they were like, liberal ideology usurped the power of Christian ideology and became the predominant ideology in America, I would say, for like the last 15 years. And they get that way in part by saying that Christianity is evil. But basically they replaced it. But now at this point, we don't, as a society, we don't really look to Christianity as as like the ideology that we're trying to get back to, and we're trying to escape from liberal ideology, and that's why we're sort of in a crisis about what to believe, because we don't believe the liberals and we don't believe the Christians, and where the Christians are generally conservatives. Those are the two competing halves of America, and according to people that are very liberal or very Christian, we are in a deep divide in this country. Like, people that are really entrenched in the camps of either one of those parties, I would argue, are the people saying the most that we are divided. And people like Fox and people like CNN, which kind of represent both of those two sides, the Republicans and the Democrats, the people who are the most Republican and the most Democrat and most entrenched in those audiences that CNN and Fox are tailoring their content towards, are the people purporting the idea that we are very divided the most. And it's advantageous for CNN and Fox to sell that message, because that makes money as long as we're in a divided state and we can't come to an agreement, and it's just this battle between, I think that the idea of the battle between Democrats and Republicans is what's keeping it alive the most. And anybody who wants it to be a fight and wants to hate the other side is going to keep that battle alive and keep it divisive. But some of the main contributors to that, like the biggest contributors to that division and that battle, I would say are the mainstream media giants that are on either side, especially because they literally need money in order to survive. But I think the fact that we've reached a point where social media controls the journalism market shows that we have the chance to move beyond the battle that exists between Republicans and Democrats. Yeah, and I think that we have a chance to really actually, we live in an environment finally where alternative opinions can be considered, like a lot of different alternative opinions can be considered, and where a lot of the markets that are important, such as journalism, or music, or like a lot of different entertainment markets, especially, or politically. Like, I think we're finally able to entertain a lot of different political options, and I think we've shown that we are more likely to arrive at a candidate that is not like Trump. Electing Trump shows you that we're likely to arrive at a candidate who isn't already a politician. That's what we want now. We want somebody who isn't a career politician, and that shows that we are entertaining a lot more alternative options. So we're more likely to elect an alternative to somebody who's a career politician. And so let's see if I can get back to what I was talking about originally. And an interesting thing about podcasts is that they are less a presentation than all the entertainment that we've been subjected to for pretty much our entire lives to this point. Because what I discussed about a presentation, like an article that you need to write the right way in order to please your audience, in order to appeal to the public's perception of what they just saw or what they just read. Like, if what they just saw was a movie, it also has to be tailored to an audience. Like, it has to be written in a way that people will like it, and it has to, and it kind of depends on what your point is anyway. If your point is to make it popular, then you are writing every single part of it as tailored to an audience, so as to make it more popular. Like, if your goal is to be popular or famous as a director with the movie that you make, like if you want it to just make a ton of money and appeal to the most people, then you have to really write it so that it appeals to everybody, and that takes a lot of meticulousness in your writing and the way that you present it, and it has to, like, you have to write it, the script, exactly the right way in order for it to appeal to the most possible people. But the entertainment that we've been subjected to forever is that way. It's a presentation. Obviously, it's some sort of presentation. Any TV show, sitcom that you watch is a presentation, and it's written in a certain way and wraps up in a certain way that it is like, oh, that was a good show. Like any drama that you see, any Broadway play has a few acts in it, and like the acts have to be set up a certain way, and like the story has to end or whatever. It has to fit all these guidelines in order for it to be a well-written story or play or book or movie or show or song or political platform or news article. It has to be written a certain way. And that's what we've been subjected to. We've been subjected to all these formulaic things. Like the music industry has probably been at its peak from like 1990 to 2010 is probably the peak of the music industry, meaning the point at which the artistry of it was overtaken by the industry side of it. The highest peak at which the industry had more control over how the country is influenced through music is like the music industry had control of that influence probably the most during 1990 to about 2010, where at which point it became very difficult for the music industry to keep up with what their formula could be to make a popular song and that kind of thing, at which point their authorities started to dissolve and the music industry is on a decline anyway. I mean, isn't that always the story? That's been the story for a long time, and the music industry is on the decline, but it used to just be that it's on the decline because Spotify and because of digital music is shared illegally, and so people aren't buying CDs. So that was why it was on the decline in the 2010s. But I'm kind of in 2000 to 2010. But I'm talking about a decline as far as their influence and their ability to prop up an artist and say this is what music is. Like their ability to have influence that way has declined rapidly in the last decade because there's not any artist that anybody says is more true than any other artist. Like it's harder for everybody to connect behind one single person, and that's because there are a lot of different, that's because of the access that everybody has to all different bands that have ever been created. As long as you have access to every single artist that's ever made songs, which you didn't have that access 10 years ago, as long as you have that access now, we can tailor all of our music to ourselves and listen to all the music that we want to, and we don't have to get it through the filter of the music industry. And because of that, we don't have to settle for the artists that the music industry says is good anymore. We can settle for any number of artists that we like because all of them are available to us, and there's millions of artists out there. But like I go off on a tangent, forget. Okay, so podcasts are different from all the media, all the entertainment that we've been presented with to this point in our lives, because they are sort of just they're just an abstraction, meaning that they don't have to have a beginning and an end. They're kind of more like time. They're more like the way that time is, because time doesn't have to do with defined spaces unless you define a space within time so as to measure it. Time has to do with time is just endlessness. Like time is already going as long as you are able to consider it. It's something that is already going, and it doesn't have an agenda. It doesn't have any agenda because it's not tailored to any audience. It's not for anybody. I mean, you'd say the same thing about space, like what we walk around in, but I'm saying that space is more reserved for things that we create, and anything is things that we create in reality in order for it to be presented to somebody for their use and your monetary benefit. Like if you create boots, and boots are they have more utility and they're more sturdy than a shoe, but they're important for a certain environment, and at least they're tailored to the audience of somebody who needs boots that walks around in the mud or more often than somebody who doesn't. So you make boots as this viable alternative to shoes, like whoever invented them, and they are for a certain audience. Anyway, what you created was a presentation, and you're presenting it to a certain audience, and ideally that audience will receive it well. Your audience will receive your presentation, your performance, like where your performance is what you created to show to the world. Like, this is what my mind was capable of envisioning, was these boots that I created, which didn't exist before, and they're better than shoes for a number of reasons, but more importantly, they're better than shoes for this specific audience. And the person that created boots presented them to his audience, and he was successful. So he turned out to be a good performer. But anyway, that was something that somebody created in space and was a finite object. A boot is a single definition. It's only one thing as distinguished from everything else that's been defined. And and because of that, it is a distinct idea. And you would say that you can't really consider its idea form unless you are considering the way it was before it existed, before somebody created it. Because before somebody created it, it was only an idea, but it is still an idea. It's just that now it's an idea trapped within specific borders, and those borders are in some ways the physical borders of what it means to fit the shape of a shoe, but also, like in idea form, it's the borders of what is that definition as distinguished from the definitions of every other idea that's been created. So anyways, space sees all creations like that, all finite things that are defined and fit a certain shape, like boots or an elephant, or like an elephant is a specific thing and that's a little different than somebody creating it, whatever. That's different from a person creating it, that it has distinct borders in reality and it fits a certain shape. There's only one thing that can be elephant shaped, right? Or a road or a fireplace or any idea that anybody's created. Those are seen by space as opposed to seen by time, and they are, as seen by space, distinguished. Every single one of the things that is in space is distinguished because it fits only one specific definition, and where definitions are different from each other, you have different values, because the reason that you create a different definition is so that you create something that has a different value than everything else that's been created. That's the only reason it is allowed to have a different definition at all, is because it is a different value. So where you have the separation of values, you have all these different competing objects. But anyway, as long as the values of them are all separated, space sees all of them as separated. Time sees everything as the same. All those things that have been created, they are the same from the perspective of time, because time is always moving, and time is an abstraction, where boots is not an abstraction, it's a practicality. Like a boot is a practicality because it's something that's tangible and something that you can see. But time sees everything as not a practicality. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter the way that they were separated at one point or another, because time only knows them as equal. Because once time has considered everything, once time has digested everything that has been created within it, it still continues and it still moves on, and it digests it so as to dissolve it to the same degree of nothingness. Like time dissolves all authorities, where each authority is just an idea, that a distinguished idea that's been presented, kind of like a definition. An authority is sort of like a definition. But anyways, time, since it goes forever and ever, and all it like already exists as forever. If you were just to consider time, it exists as before you or after you, and before the world and after the world. Now, well, there's something to be said about that time began with the Big Bang, but it began with the Big Bang as far as our universe is considered. But then time is still above the authority of the universe and above the authority of the Big Bang if you consider that there's possibly other universes. But so that is a lot of theoretical talk, and this is all theoretical talk. But anyway, a podcast, see, this is the point I want to get to, where it's not ironic, where I can finally, where I'm just on the other side of it, and I'm just saying it because then it is my thoughts, and it isn't filtered. It's just my thoughts, and it isn't filtered, and it isn't a presentation at that point. It's just something I say because at the end of the day, there is something that you want to say. And now I'm talking about any person, any individual person. There's something that you want to say. I strongly believe like you can send out a free flowing string of words that is just your perspective concentrated. That is the truth of your perspective. Like everybody has the truth of their perspective that they are able to say. Not that everybody wants to communicate it the same way. Not that everybody wants to communicate it verbally even, but people have truth from their perspective. And you should try to get to the point that you can say it, rather than that you have all these barriers to it that cause you to filter your speech, and then the end product of your speech is just a presentation or a performance because you had to tailor it to an audience. Like you should try to get to a point where you're not tailoring your speech to an audience. And for me, that point is some point where I can just say stuff endlessly. And I enjoy that if I can get to that point. I can just talk, and everything, all the ideas that I'm thinking about are more easily connected, and I can see where they're connected. But that even is a perspective that is closer to a perspective of time than a perspective that is littered, encumbered, and hindered by practicality, by space, by practicality, by rationality, by you have to make sure that you're saying, and I say that because if you're filtering your speech so as to make it a performance, it is hindered by practicality. It's hindered by you have to say things rationally and make sure that everything sounds right in accordance with societal norms of what speech is supposed to sound like. And it is more that way the more that you have the more that you have a perspective that's encumbered by practicality, by having to say everything exactly about the definitions of things. But anyways, so time is a perspective that is more in agreement with the entertainment format of a podcast, because a podcast is like an abstraction the same way time is an abstraction, as opposed to it being like space, which is constituent of in abstractions, practicalities, things with borders. Time is an abstraction, and a podcast is an abstraction because it's closer to not having a beginning and an end. Like people still begin their podcast and close it out, and they want to have a theme, right? People still want to have a theme, still want to make it sort of a presentation. But the reason that it is popular, and we've reached this point in society where we're like, oh, we like podcasts now, it's because a podcast is a more relatively truthful form of entertainment than the forms of entertainment we've been presented with to this point, which all have to go through a number of filters and rules in order to be tailored to an audience and come out the right way. So podcasts are less tailored to an audience, and you know that because they are longer, and you can just you can have a podcast where you talk about one movie for like 4 hours, where you talk about a movie for 4 hours, and like if somebody really liked that movie, then they'll be interested the entire time. But because you can talk about it for 4 hours, you're getting really far into the details of your opinions of that movie. Like it's becoming really interpretive as opposed to practical and rational, the more that you just talk about one subject forever. But anyways, podcasts are that more so than entertainment formats of the past, platforms of the past, because they go on and on like time does. They can go on, and they're basically the same thing the entire time too. They aren't like, they go on and on like it's just me talking, but from my interpretive perspective, and that's what this podcast is. And it goes on and doesn't have to have a distinct beginning and end. And like, at least the way that I see it and the way that I think a podcast should be, it's like I don't have to present it as one thing, even though I title every podcast as one thing. But even then, everybody, when they title their podcast, they're not depending on those titles or the themes of their podcast in order for its entertainment value to shine through. They're not reliant on the titles of it or the presentation of it. They're reliant on just if the content of their interpretation was interesting enough to people. And if it is, then it becomes a popular podcast. And so it does have a lot more to do with people's individual interpretations, and people want to hear people's ideas more so. And in my opinion, that is what makes a podcast more popular, is if you are speaking your interpretation as truthfully as possible. But the entertainment medium of a podcast is more relatively truthful than entertainments of the past, because it is less relatively false. It's less relatively false and derivative of patterns that people, or derivative of patterns and rules that somebody had to follow. It is not derivative of patterns and rules that somebody had to follow. Everybody can make a podcast and just say whatever they want. And since all podcasts can just be put onto iTunes, anybody has the chance to listen to anybody's podcast and accept and identify with the interpretations that they like the most. But we only are able to have a relatively more truthful medium of entertainment, such as a podcast, because of the internet and because of accessibility and universal accessibility of your own content, because of the availability of it, because anybody can put their things online. And it didn't used to be that way, but now that we have arrived at a point where anybody can put their content online, because we've developed the technology and reached a higher level of intelligence in order to do that, because we've arrived there, we no longer have to compromise and listen to the influence of formats that were relatively more false, of formats that were more a presentation and more written to be tailored to an audience. And really, probably the more successful your podcast will be is the more successful it'll be. And the more successful it'll be is if the less that you record the sounds of your mouth and the saliva moving around in your mouth, which I know I have recorded, and I'm too lazy to take out of previous podcasts, and I'm too close to the microphone. And you do have to still make it a presentation somewhat. Like, you still have to make sure that there's not spit in your mouth, because people don't like that, but it's not going to be ultimately what turns somebody away if your interpretation is interesting and ubiquitous. If your interpretation appeals to people, it doesn't matter. Saliva is sounds. But the more successful that your podcast is going to be is the more that you don't have an audience, is the more that you say, this is for nobody. but the only entertainments that anybody's been able to make to this point is for an audience. But now with a podcast, we truly have the chance to be like, fuck it. It's for nobody. This is just me talking for an hour. Buy it or don't buy it. And I wish I can get to a point where that's what all of my podcasts sound like. But like what I do is I recorded a few of them, and I've recorded a few of them, and I just think about that. I wish that they could be better. And that's garbage, because as long as you say to yourself that you're trending in a direction, you're practicing and getting better at the podcast, like you can't expect yourself to be perfect at it right from the get-go. And really there's a lot of artistic value in it sounding like shit at the beginning, and then you getting better at it. Like there's a lot of artistic value in people hearing your shit and your vulnerability and how bad you are and how embarrassing it is. There's people like that, even if it is bad, even if it is like more towards infamy than fummy. If it's more towards if it's more a negative press, if it's negative press as opposed to positive, like people still like it, even if it's maligned. Like people still are drawn to it. So then it depends on what you're valuing. Are you valuing just somebody to be drawn to it? Like you don't want to just make embarrassing That's the thing. If you tried to make embarrassing content, it would not be anywhere near as interesting as content that is genuinely embarrassing because somebody tried hard. Like, so if I make content that is genuinely a fuck up, like embarrassing because I'm muttering or not able to get out my points quickly enough, then it's still good. It's still good is something that I should realize. There's a song by Tame Impala called Half Full Glass of Wine, and Tame Impala is one of the biggest rock bands in the world today. As far as a rock band in the world can be successful today, so they have this song called Half Full Glass of Wine, and it sounds really great if they play it live now. Like you can watch a video of them playing it live at the Reading Festival in 2013, and it's about 8 minutes long, and it sounds like a Cream song, at least in the beginning, but they level out of it for the middle, and the middle is like 4 minutes long, but then they go back into their intro, which is like 2 minutes long. The beginning is 2 minutes long, the end is 2 minutes long, but the instrumental for the intro and the end are the same, and the middle is a different instrumental. But the song sounds great, and especially if you watch the video for the Reading Festival like 2013. But you can also watch them play that same song like 4 years prior, and you can watch them play that same song 4 years prior, and it sounds like shit in comparison to what it sounded like when they played it live 2013. And it doesn't sound anything like, I mean, you can tell that it's the same song. It's just like all the stuff that made it really good, like everything that they perfected over time was not there when they first started playing it live, but they still had to start playing it live in order to understand what its potential was, like in order to see, in order to fulfill your true vision of it. But that's when it goes back to what is your trust in your project anyway, because so the guy that wrote it, the guy from the band that wrote it had a vision for it in his head. He's like, it'll sound this way, it'll sound really great, but it's like, so then you play it live in 2009 or whatever, and it probably sort of fit the vision that he was envisioning, but it wasn't. But it just goes to show that if you don't just take it at face value, like it came out that certain way for him when he wrote it, like the way that they played it in 2009, but he understood its potential long term, that he could tweak some things and make it sound really, really great. And to the point that, because he believed in the song's potential and believed in himself and the project he was working on, he was able to make it really good because he had patience. He had patience to see it through and make it make it good, because he understood that it could ultimately be better. And but you have to, I think you have to be public with it as not completed project. Like in some instances, you have to be public with it not existing as perfect in order to start doing it at all. And like, that's a sacrifice that a lot of people aren't willing to make. Like, to not, because if you come out with a podcast and it sounds like garbage and it's dumb and not interesting, you know that people automatically think like the podcast will be bad from now into the future. Like, it's not like it's going to get better. Like, people aren't going to look at the potential of your podcast if it sounds like trash in the beginning. You are the only person that can understand the potential of it and try to make it better if you believe in the project enough to keep it going rather than shut it down. But it's really not, it shouldn't be a big deal with a podcast anyway, because you can just record them endlessly. It's not like anybody has to hear them, and it doesn't have to be good. And that's why a podcast, it can be garbage. You know, there's thousands of podcasts out there right now that are dog shit. And so you should make a podcast just to see. You should make one anyway. And you can talk about whatever. I'm talking about performances. So a podcast is abstract because it keeps going. And I'm trying to work out this idea better in my head, because the idea that I'm saying is like, so there's this horror movie called Midsommar, and it's from a production company called A24, who made Hereditary and some other modern horror movies, but they just made a lot of good movies recently because the format of their movies is not the same as the typical presentation format that wraps up a movie really well. Like, it's a new and improved movie format, and that's why they're popular and relevant in 2020, is because they make movies that abide by a format that is less subject to rules and is more okay with being an abstraction. The movies that they make are more abstract, meaning that they don't have a beginning and an end. They just are endless, the same way that time is. And that's kind of what a podcast is, at least in comparison to other entertainment formats. It keeps going, and it doesn't have to have a beginning and an end, and it can just be one continuous stream, even over podcast episodes, if you want to look at it that way. I know that probably that's what mine sounds like. Like, it's just me, my interpretation of the world for endlessly. It doesn't really have a beginning and an end. I'm not trying to I'm not ultimately trying to make it a theme, but that's something you should strive for anyway, because that is the pathway of truth. Because something that is more relatively truthful and will be interesting to the world is something that is less restrictive of less subject to barriers, and less inherently inhibited or restricted, and unfiltered. It'll be more popular if it's unfiltered. If you can get to the point where you don't filter your mouth, your dumb mouth, if you don't filter your stupid mouth for other people, then you are more relatively truthful, because relative falseness is the result of you inhibiting yourself. You will come across as false if you don't share your opinion. And the reason that you don't share your opinion accurately and you come across as fake, quote unquote, the reason that you become fake is because you're not sharing your opinion accurately. And you do that when there are more taboos for you to abide by, and you say that there are all these things that you can't do and you can't say, and you make it so that you are subject to barriers in your speech. Like, the more that you're subject to barriers in your speech, the more relatively false that you will be. So you need to try to be honest. But, like, it's not that simple it's not that simple. There are, you can, it's not that simple to just be like, well, I'm going to try to be more truthful. Like, there's a lot that goes into the person that you are from what you're speaking about in front of other people. The person that you've now come to identify yourself as being in front of other people, there's a lot that goes into that identity and that person that other people see. So it's not like you can perform a quick change because you decided that you want to be more honest. That might work for a day. Be like, yep, I'm just going to be honest all the time. That'll work for a day. And then what you'll find is that you are inescapably linked to the identity that you have agreed to with other people. And more on that some other time. But so I speak, so I'm trying to work out in my head, because this is a podcast and I can just keep talking forever, even though it started. See, in my head right now, in the back of my mind, I keep thinking, well, you got on this nice train of thought where you finally broke through that wall to make it not so much a presentation, and now it's just you speaking. And don't go back to it. Don't let it go. Don't let it take you over again. You got to stay on this high. You got to stay up here so that you don't fall down and go back down there where my speech is, go back down to where my speech is inherently inhibited. I don't want to go back there, but I could go back there at any time. So that's what you worry about. But so I want to stay where I keep talking. So I got to keep talking, or else something terrible is going to happen. If I don't keep talking, awful things will befall my family and friends, and I will lose all my possessions and probably die. But so I'm talking about abstraction. I'm talking about the movie Midsommar and why it's an abstraction, and why that format, it's a movie format that is more abstract than practical. It's more abstract than it is derivative of a pattern. And it is that way because Midsommar doesn't really have an end to, well, it does have an end. It does have an end. It's just that during the course of the movie, it's not like all these plots are being developed in order for the storyline to continue. There aren't plots, there aren't points where things end or begin. There aren't points of reference that you're like, oh, that's when this happened, and then this all happened because of that point of reference. Like, they don't really do points of reference, because the point of the movie is that the main characters are getting sucked more and more into this cult just by nature of them being in it, and because they're just by nature of them being around the people that are practicing the cult, and they just get slowly sucked into it, and there isn't really a point that they do. It's just that they over time become part of the cult. But it's abstract in that way, where you don't really know where things are ending and where they're beginning. Like the main group of people that arrived on the island where the cult is doing their cult stuff, they are slowly going away, but there aren't, like, the main characters aren't trying to find them or anything. Like, the main characters are still just going about their business. They're still going about their business, and yeah, and it does eventually wrap up. It's just that the movie is just this one big fading from beginning to end. It's just a fading, rather than that there are a number of frames of reference within it. Like, you can, because it is a movie, like, you can point to important parts of it. I'm just saying that it is relatively more abstract than other movie formats, and doesn't try to really tell you why either. It doesn't try to tell you what the point is of the movie, is another important part of it. They don't try to tell you what the point is. And there's a lot of movies that do that anyway, but they're still, like, indirectly want you to figure it out. I think Midsommar is more like, it's not necessarily that they want you to figure it out either. It's just like, this is the presentation of this series of events. And because of that, it's like an abstraction. But so it's like an abstraction in that it's just like a endless string. It's just an endless string. It's relatively more abstract than the Bourne Identity or whatever. Like the Bourne Identity is just plots, but that's like any 2000. I'm just saying any 2000s movie or any romantic comedy. It's just these plots and scenes. Like scenes are important. Scenes are not important in Midsummer. And like the character interactions, like the character arcs don't amount to anything, I think, as much as I know about that term, character arc. Yeah, and there's a lot of different levels at which you can evaluate movies, and I don't know about most of them. Like character arcs, like there's some people that are only looking at the character arc when they're watching a movie, or they're like, oh, the character arcs, the character development was really good for these characters. Like that's what they value when they watch a movie. It seems like everybody values something different. When I watch a movie, I'm always very, very meticulous about the acting performances. And like the more that I've watched movies over time, the more that I get upset if like the acting is even slightly off. Like I'm really interested in the acting performances and the way that the actors or actresses acted the character. That's what I'm most interested in. And if they all did good, then I'm like, that's a great movie. If everybody acted well, then it's a great movie. It's like besides, there's plenty of movies that I watch it for the story as well as the acting. Like there's other factors to consider. It's not like I just watch the acting. Duh. Come on. It's not. Stop saying that. I don't do just that. I do more than. I do it because if you have to make and then do it for you, and can you do it? If you don't have an audience, then the less that you have an audience, the better it is. If you can just make it that like, haha, just speaking to nobody, then you win the game. Then you win. Because it's not tailored to anybody. You're not like, you don't have an audience in mind. And I don't try to make it about one person. And I don't get worried about, oh, am I going to run out of things to say? Because if I did the same thing tomorrow, my head would be in a different place and I could riff on one or 2 points a lot. And the points would be at least slightly different than the points that I'm speaking about today, even though they would probably be related to identity or performance or authority. But, so this is an hour and 11 minutes. It's a very, very fun hour and 11 minutes. I was very glad to be here. I had a great time talking at your campus, and the pleasure was all mine. And I'm very, 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 very excited to come back. And I had a great reception, and everybody's been very nice and very kind, and lots of great questions. And I always like questions, and I just love talking about this. I love talking about my work. I just love talking about it. I love doing this. I love it. I love being this. And to that I say, how is that possible? How does anybody love what they're doing so much? Anybody that comes at you saying, I love what I'm doing. Like, this is me making this podcast is the thing I like doing the most right now, probably at this time in my life, because I can pretend that it has some sort of value. I can pretend that it has some sort of value outside of just myself. But I guess I would, if I was just making a podcast for a living, then I would love what I'm doing. And I'd be like, I love what I'm doing, but I still wouldn't say that a lot to people. I wouldn't be like, I just love my work. It doesn't matter that it's not a sacrifice for me. I just love my work. I probably wouldn't, I don't know. And that's just a personality difference between me and then somebody who's more outgoing about themselves, I guess. I wouldn't be like, I love my work. I love my work. I just love doing this. Oh, I do too. I do work now. I do yours work. What kind of person am I talking about? I'm not totally sure, but I'm picturing somebody who speaks at a campus and speaks about some specific thing that's specific to them that ultimately they only care about, but because it's specific to them. You would love what you're doing if you're doing something that's specific to you. If you're in an environment where you get to communicate what truth is to you, if you get to present an idea and be behind an idea that is totally from you, then that's when you love what you're doing. If you make a new business and it is your idea and it's successful, that's when you love what you're doing because you have presented an idea to the world. Then you love it because it is from you, the same way that you love your family and your kids as opposed to somebody else's family because it is from you and is your kid. It's you and you. That's why you love it. So you would love what you're doing if it is an environment where you aren't restricted by other people telling you what to do and to present yourself a certain way. You love what you're doing if you can present truth, meaning you can present yourself uninhibited and naked. No, not naked. Just you love it when nudity is, and when it's who said that? Who said that? That wasn't kosher. Do you ever? Oh, yeah. Like you can't say naked or nudity like it's bad. Don't talk about nudity. Don't talk about the idea of being bare. I was listening to his podcast and he said naked. Like anybody would care about something like that in this year. Like it's something I got. What is he? Some kind of perv? He always talks about naked. Like what is the point of me even discussing it to myself? Like it's a problem? It's not a problem. And nothing I say is a problem. Everything I say is everything right. All right, so that's the end of my podcast.